Okay. So, welcome everyone to the 15th event of the PSA MPG seminar series. My name's Abby Rhodes. I'm one of the co-conveners of the specialist group, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. So we welcome today Dr. Charlotte Rose Kennedy, who's going to be discussing her research that's rooted in linguistics with a focus on protest coverage in the press. So I'll give you a little bit about Charlotte. She received her AHRC-funded PhD in linguistics from the Nottingham Trent University in 2023. Her postgraduate research drew on Corpus-Assisted Discourse Studies and Political Sociology to develop an interdisciplinary framework to guide the critical linguistic analysis of media representations of protests. Charlotte is currently a Knowledge Transfer Partnership Associate in partnership with the Birmingham City University and Senso.Cloud, and she works as a safeguarding language specialist and uses corpus linguistics tools to help Senso.Cloud improve their safeguarding capabilities to protect children from online harms. If you want to know a little bit more about Charlotte and the broader work that she does, she has a website at crkennedy.co.uk, and that's available in the Eventbrite link. I'll also put it into the chat shortly. But without further ado, I will hand over to Charlotte. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you everyone for joining us today and giving me the opportunity to share some of my research. So yeah, thank you for that. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a framework that I developed during my PhD, and I'm going to be talking about how it can be used in the context of media discourse and news media, the news representations of protests. So my presentation today is: how do worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment manifest in protest coverage, and what are the implications? So to start, I'm going to give you an introduction of worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment, or the acronym WUNC. I'm then going to talk about how WUNC displays can manifest linguistically and be identified in discourse using the linguistic WUNC framework that I developed during my PhD. I'm then going to use a case study to kind of show you how you can use it. So having a look at the mediated WUNC displays in the US news media coverage of the pro-choice protests that took place following the overturning of Roe v. Wade in America last summer. And then I'm just going to talk about the conclusion and some implications of the findings of the case study, and also implications of using the linguistic WUNC framework in research. So firstly, an introduction to worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment. This is a theory from somebody called Charles Tilly, and Charles Tilly was a prominent researcher of social movements, and his work revolutionised our understanding of protest, social conflict and public contention. And while his work was expansive, Charles Tilly did so much work to do with protests. This research and my framework takes particular interest in arguments from his book Social Movements 1768 to 2004, in which he offers a three-part criteria as to what constitutes a social movement, stating they emerge from a synthesis of three elements, which are on the screen now. So the first is that a social movement is a sustained, organised public effort making collective claims on target authorities, so a campaign. The second part is that social movements employ political action, so public meetings, rallies, petition drives, protests and such and the like. And he calls this varial ensemble of performances a social movement repertoire. And then lastly, Tilly says that social movements participants have concerted public representations of WUNC. So that's worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment on part of themselves and all their constituencies, until he calls these WUNC displays. So largely, worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment kind of translate to how successful, how strong and how impactful a protest will be, how convincing it will be, how likely it is to succeed. Worthiness largely relates to a protest's perceived legitimacy, so how good the people protesting are they good citizens, are they deserving, do they deserve to get what they want, are they protesting peacefully? All of these things for what make for a worthy display of protest. So Tilly also notes that protests that are attended by dignitaries or celebrities, elite people, can imbue a protest with worthiness. So it's really the deservingness of a protest. Do the protesters deserve to get what they want? That's largely what worthiness relates to. Unity relates to displays of direct affirmations of a common goal or identity. So do all of the protesters agree? Do they all want the same thing? This can be displayed through marching collectively, singing collectively, chanting collectively, all wearing the same dress and things of that nature to really show that they're a unified front. We also have numbers, so higher displays of numbers are displayed by lots and lots of people protesting and lots of names on petitions. And commitment largely relates to how dedicated protesters are to their cause, whether they're braving bad weather to participate or whether they have been participating in protests for the same cause for years. This kind of shows their commitment to the cause. So presentations of WUNC by protesters are often termed displays or broadcasts because they're something protesters seek to do. They're a performance, and they seek to portray these elements of worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment, particularly in the media, where protesters can amplify their message to potential supporters and influence power holders as well. So as a concept, WUNC acts as a theoretical scorecard against which a protest's potential success, impact and strength can be measured. So if any of the four components of WUNC are weak or not present, protests could potentially lose their strength, their impact, and not become successful. So Tilly says that entirely unworthy or completely uncommitted participants, regardless of how numerous and or unified, quite undermine the impacts of any demonstration. That said, a very small number of highly worthy, highly unified and highly committed persons can produce a larger impact. So WUNC displays here then embody effective demonstrations, and they represent serious stakes because they convey crucial political messages that say, pay attention to us, we matter, listen to our cause. As such then, a protest with higher displays of WUNC that is high in worthiness, high in unity, high in numbers and high in commitment is more likely to convince the public and politicians that they're a legitimate cause worth getting behind, and that the potential success increases compared to if their worthiness, unity, numbers or commitment are weak or are not there at all. And because of this, disputes on protest actions often centre on the components of WUNC. So, for example, a protest advocates will probably say that there was a larger number of people there than a protest critics will. And because of this, because it's through the mass media that the public largely view protests, coverage that affords protests high levels of WUNC make it more likely that a protest will gain sympathy or gain support. Conversely then, if a protest WUNC is downplayed in the media, it makes it less likely that a protest will gain public and political support as well. So editors and journalists therefore have the power to kind of manipulate or emphasise or de-emphasise certain aspects of worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment when covering protests to align themselves with the ideological or commercial interests of the news outlet that they represent or are writing for. So that's kind of an overview of WUNC as a theoretical scorecard and the elements of worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment. Now going to move on to how WUNC displays can manifest linguistically and how they can be identified in discourse and in media texts about protests. So during my PhD, I operationalised this conceptualisation of worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment as a linguistic WUNC framework to investigate media representations of protests. And within this framework, WUNC constitute representational axes whereby protests can be represented exhibiting high or low levels and displays of these positively valued qualities. The four elements of worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment variously encode different types of legitimation, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but these largely refer to a legitimation through authority, through conformity, and through morality, which basically means that any protest that is represented in high levels of worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment is also then afforded greater legitimacy than those that are not. So to demonstrate how the linguistic framework can be used, I'm going to use some examples for some recent research about US media representations of protests that took place in response to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. I conducted this with a colleague from Lancaster University, Gavin Brooks. So I'm just going to give some examples of how WUNC can manifest linguistically using some examples from our data set, and then I'm going to go on to talk about the data as a case study. So firstly, how can worthiness manifest linguistically, and how can it be identified in discourse? Well, Tilly argues that it's respectable protesters who behave with decorum and discipline are the ones that display worthiness. So those that are good and deserving citizens are worthy protesters. Those that protest peacefully and make demands legitimacy and avoid violent activity are those that are worthy. So in linguistics then, we could choose, or journalists could choose, to report on protesters' actions through different types of verbs that express different levels of peace or violence. So choosing to report on protesters' actions through transitive verbs that express violent behaviour would then lessen their mediated displays of worthiness. So for example, we have here, US senators could be targeted by protesters at their homes. So the semantics of targeted, it's not a particularly peaceful verb, it's not a particularly neutral verb, it's something that encodes a level of violence, or perhaps something that we would associate perhaps with an animal targeting its prey or something like that. So we have these kind of violent connotations within this verb, which would linguistically reduce the mediated representations of worthiness in the context of protests. On the other hand, though, we could choose to represent protesters' actions through transitive verbs that encode peaceful behaviour to increase their mediated displays of worthiness. So we have here the protesters expressed frustration with politics and joy in community. Expressed frustration is quite a peaceful way of protesting. It's not shouting, it's not arguing, it's not yelling. Expressing frustration is perhaps a more decorous way to protest. And because of this, their mediated representations of worthy would increase. So Tilly also says then that it's elite and authoritative people that support a protest can imbue a protest with worthiness. And Van Leuven refers to this kind of legitimation as vested institutional authority. If somebody with vested institutional authority supports something, we can say that then it's legitimate. So we might have somebody, a prominent political figure or some kind of elite celebrity that came out in support of a protest or possibly attended a protest. And if this was reported on in the press, we could say that this increases the mediated displays of worthiness of a protest. In contrast to that, though, if elite and institutionally authoritative people speak out against or criticise a protest, it can negatively impact its perceived worthiness. So here, again, an example from the data set. Former Vice President and staunch anti-abortionist Mike Pence told an audience to pray that Conservative Supreme Court justices who've been targeted by abortion right protesters stand firm and overturn Roe versus Wade. So from the very nature of former vice president saying this, it imbues what he's saying with legitimacy. So the fact that he is speaking out against a protest reduces that protest legitimacy. If he was talking out in support of a protest, it would then increase the protest legitimacy and perceived worthiness. So there's some of the ways in which we can identify displays of worthiness linguistically and see how we can identify them in discourse. Moving on to unity now. Tilly says that high displays of unity are those that express direct affirmation of a common goal or identity, and this is signalled by collectively marching, dancing, singing and cheering, and dressing in unison. So linguistically then, we can identify these kinds of representations of protesters being in collective agreement of something through predication and referential strategies that describe them wearing matching clothes, for example. So you could imagine a report of protesters saying the protesters, who were all waving England flags, marched forth. So all of them waving England flags, for example, would be a high display of unity. But we can also have high displays of unity manifest linguistically when protesters are collectivized agents of transitive verbs. So, for example, in this extract from the University Wire, protesters started to simultaneously chant. We have the collectivized noun and pluralized noun of protesters, so we know that they're in a group, and they're chanting simultaneously. They're all saying the same thing together, so that representing then a unified front. There's a high display of unity there. In terms of numbers, high displays of numbers are broadcasted through large numbers of activists filling streets and signing petitions. Linguistically then, we could see these high displays of numbers through verbs and referential strategies that infer a high degree of numbers, possibly through aggregation, so through the explicit reference of a particular number, or through collectivization. So in these three examples, we have protesters flooded the streets and state capitol steps. There can't just be one protester flooding something. There has to be numerous, possibly hundreds or thousands of people to be described as flooding. So we have here this inference of a high number of protesters through the verb flooded. We also have the aggregation, thousands of protesters, and the collectivization, a large group of abortion rights protesters. So here, these all infer high displays of numbers. However, aggregation and collectivization, as well as individualization, so just referring to one protester, for example, could also be used to reduce these displays and suggest that the turnout was fewer, that there was low displays of numbers. So we have here about 15 protesters and also a small group of pro-abortion protesters. So there's lower displays of numbers here. In terms of commitment then, lastly, Tilly says that displays of commitment are shown through persistence in costly or risky activity, in protesters' declarations of readiness to persevere, in their resistance to attack, when they're braving bad weather to protest, when there's visible participation by elderly people or those with visible illnesses or disabilities, and when protesters display ostentatious sacrifice, subscription, and benefaction to their cause. These can manifest linguistically variously, and I've written quite extensively about commitment, but I'm just going to go through a few of them here. So, for example, a high display of commitment could be expressed through a transitive verb that described a protest engaging in sacrifice or risk. So, for example, we have here in the Philadelphia Daily News, protesters were prepared for the possibility of arrest on the offset. So we've got preparing for arrest, being happy to be arrested for their cause is a display of ostentatious sacrifice and persistence in risky activity. We could also see or identify referential and predication strategies to represent high levels of commitment if they describe the characteristics that Tilly deems committed. So, for example, being elderly or being risky or being persistent. So the grey-haired and wrinkled protesters, for example, shows that the protesters are of an older age and are therefore committed to the protest. We also have in the second example, topless pro-Roe protesters storm the court. So we've got protesters engaging in risk in these referential strategies. And then we also lastly have the predication strategy for Sadie Coons, who's an organiser of Our Rights DC, and this person has organised more than 30 protests. So we can see here we've got this commitment, we've got this dedication. There's an extensive amount of protests for the same cause that are being organised by this person here. So now I've kind of explain some of the ways in which WUNC displays can manifest linguistically and be identified in discourse. I'm going to move on to the case study to show how myself and my co-author applied this framework to the Roe v. Wade protests. So just to give a little bit of background in case anybody isn't familiar, in 1973, the US Supreme Court passed Roe v. Wade, which established women's rights, legal right to have an abortion, and made it unconstitutional for any state to ban abortion outright. And this issue was very divisive within US society and in other societies as well, but specifically the Roe v. Wade was passed in the US. And this divisive issue kind of created two camps. There was the pro-choice side of the debate, which welcomed the ruling, but there was also the pro-life debate, who were comprising anti-abortion groups, which were in support of the ruling. In 2022, the US Supreme Court revoked the constitutional right to access safe abortion and overturned Roe v. Wade. So that means now that individual US states now have the authority to implement their own laws concerning abortion. Recent scholars have argued that this ruling can be viewed as part of a broader anti-gender movement, and it represents a rolling back of women's hard-won reproductive rights. So this controversial overturning of the Roe v. Wade ruling was swiftly followed and anticipated by protests, which were staged throughout the US and beyond, both prior to and in the immediate aftermath of this ruling. And in our forthcoming paper, myself and Gavin Brooks, my co-author, consider how the news media in the US represented these protests based on an analysis of a corpus of newspaper articles published in the month of, the month prior to, and the month after the ruling. We approached the analysis by using my linguistic WUNC framework to determine the extent to which coverage of pro-choice protesters were interpreted as being legitimate or delegitimate, and what the implications of these representations are. So just a quick note on methods, how we went about doing this. We took a corpus linguistic approach to critical discourse analysis. So just very briefly, corpus linguistics can be described as a field of research, but also a collection of methods that are used to study naturally occurring language, such as newspaper articles, in large bodies of which, so hundreds or possibly even thousands of newspaper articles, for example. And transfer them into machine readable formats so that they can be analysed qualitatively and quantitatively on specific corpus software online. And we took a critical discourse analysis approach. So we view language in this approach as a social practice through which ideologies and power relations are expressed, maintained, and challenged. And because of the contentious nature of protest, you'll often find in linguistics that a linguistic study of the representations of protests often takes this kind of critical discourse analysis approach. It's a kind of a dissenting approach that seeks to hold those in power to account and uncover and unpick these ideological power relations that are maintained in institutions such as the news media. So we collected a corpus, so a data set essentially, of 632 newspaper articles, which worked out to about 500,000 words, contributed by 28 print and online US newspapers that mentioned the lemma protest. So the asterisk there stands for a wild card, so protest, protested, protester, protests, for example, and Roe v. Wade in the headline and or lead paragraph between the 1st of May 2022 and the 31st of July 2022. We then use Sketch Engine, which is a corpus software tool, to identify collocates of the word protester. So collocates basically just refers to words that are have a high chance of occurring together. So like high five, for example, are collocates of each other. The high often collocates with five. So we use Sketch Engine to identify collocates of the word protester, and we focused on collocates that denoted processes of which protester was the subject. So we wanted to look at verbs, essentially, of which protesters were the subject in order to analyse what the protesters were represented as doing. So we followed the linguistic WUNC framework to manually analyse the collocates in their context, or as we refer to it in corpus linguistics, their concordances or their concordance lines. So basically the line of text in which they originally occurred in the newspaper article. And we labelled the concordances as being either high or low in the various elements of WUNC. So of the 524 collocates, 73% represented pro-choice protesters. So we decided to focus on the pro-choice protesters rather than the pro-life protesters. And we manually coded all of the instances in which these collocates occurred with one of the following codes based on the linguistic framework that I've just previously went over. So we had high worthiness, high unity, high numbers, high commitment, or low worthiness, low unity, low numbers, and low commitment. And in applying the linguistic WUNC framework, then we were granted with a means of determining the degrees of legitimacy, so broadly high or low, depending on the tags that were afforded to the protests in relation to the various elements of worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. In doing this, we found that just over 72% of concordances constituted representations of protest WUNC. So the protesters were represented as being, to varying extents, worthy, unified, numerous, and committed in almost 3/4 of the data. Of these, just over 73% included high levels of WUNC, and 26.81% featured low levels of WUNC. So they were largely broadly represented as being high in the majority of these features, as you can see here. So we can see with unity, numbers, and commitment that the over 90% mostly were represented as high. So in 90% of the times in which unity, numbers, and commitment were tagged, there were high displays in 94.5, 90.7, and 95.83% of times for unity, numbers, and commitment respectively. However, worthiness kind of books this trend, and we have actually low displays, which are in the majority here for worthiness. So 81.58% of times in which worthiness occurred, there were actually low displays of worthiness. So while the coverage mostly focused on worthiness and unity, protesters were largely represented as displaying low levels of worthiness in about 82% of occasions. In contrast, protesters were represented as high in unity, numbers, and commitment in over 90% of occasions for each element of WUNC. So when we're thinking of this WUNC scorecard, which I spoke about a little bit at the beginning, we have a high score then in unity, numbers, and commitment, but a very low score in worthiness. So I'm just going to now show you some of the concordance lines in which we tagged as low, as having low worthiness and in high unity, numbers, and commitment, to give you an idea of how we arrived at these conclusions. So here's some examples of low concordance lines that were tagged as low worthiness. So we have here, elsewhere, pro-abortion protesters targeted churches on Mother's Day. So as I spoke a little bit more about earlier, targeted is not necessarily a positive verb, but it encodes semantics of violence. So for that reason, it was tagged as low worthiness, because we have this kind of negative valuation of the verb. But also the rest of the context in which it occurs, the pro-abortion protesters targeted churches on Mother's Day. So Charles Tilley notes that mothers with children and the clergy are basically represent the gold standard of good and deserving citizens. So by targeting these good and deserving citizens, the worthiness of the protesters was reduced even more. So it wasn't even just the verb, it was the fact that who they were targeting actually worked to reduce the displays of worthiness for the protesters in this occasion. In the second example, then, we have elite and authoritative figures speaking out against the protests, condemning the protests. So we have the White House condemning protesters acting with violence, threats, or vandalism, and backed the ability for Supreme Court justices to do their jobs without concern for their personal safety. So this relates to protesters going to Supreme Court justices' homes and protesting on their front yards, essentially. So here then we've got low displays of worthiness in these two extracts, and this delegitimates the protests. We have the negative moral evaluation, which is something that Van Leuven says is a delegitimating factor. So negative moral evaluation in the inferred violent behaviour through the verb targeted. And we also have criticism from those with vested institutional authorisation. So the overall representation in terms of worthiness is delegitimation. However, we have high levels of unity throughout. So the protesters chanted "women's rights are human rights" and carried placards that read "bands off our bodies" and "leave my vagina alone." We have protesters saying that the decision to end federal rights to abortion defies the will of the public, and collectively calling on officials to find alternate ways of protecting abortion. So here we have legitimation through high levels of unity. So we have consensus, there's the collective agreeing and collectively saying the same things, which is another thing that Van Leuven terms as a legitimating factor. If we have a large consensus, we have authorization, legitimation through that. We also have, by including the speech of protesters, the showcasing of their purpose and their reason for demonstrating. And Van Leuven calls this instrumental rationalization. So if we have a purpose for something, we have it, he refers to it as instrumental rationalization. And these are particularly legitimizing when they contain implicit reference to moral values of reasonableness, appropriateness, and importance. And we can see this positive moral evaluation here as well. So we have the appropriateness to leave other people's body parts alone. It's reasonable not to defy the will of the public, and it's widely accepted that protecting human rights is important. So not only are the protesters showed to be highly unified here, but they're also showed to be legitimate through positive moral evaluation, because the things that they stand for are represented as being moral. In terms of numbers then, we have high displays throughout. There's just coverage of large crowds of protesters assembling, and also verbs that denote actions such as swarming and flooding, as we saw before. So protesters had swarmed the Supreme Court. And here again, this high displays of numbers infer legitimation. And again, it's through consensus. And Wouters and Walgrave offer a very nice quote here that says, "Numerical strength aligns with the majoritarian logic of representative democracy." So this means then that a protest with a high turnout suggests that a large proportion of the public support its views and is therefore legitimated through consensus. This also suggests that that high numbers offer a valuable display of support and approval, and these are also key components of legitimation by consensus. In terms of commitment then, we have high levels of commitment throughout the coverage in our data set. So we have coverage of protesters blocking traffic, so something engaging in risky behaviour, and getting arrested for doing that. So, you know, that's particularly risky behaviour. We also have protesters saying they've been invested in the fight for abortion access for generations. So we can see that they're committed and they're determined because they've been doing this for years. And we also have protesters braving bad weather as well. So despite remarkably hot weather, the protesters remained strong throughout the 3-hour event. So here we've got then legitimation through high commitment. And this is because we have this implicit reference to moral evaluation legitimation here. So displaying unwavering perseverance and ostentatious sacrifice for a cause implies that it's worth fighting for. So preparing to be arrested, preparing to, you know, stand in a 3-hour event despite remarkably hot weather, investing in the fight for abortion access for generations. This implies that it's a cause worth fighting for, and this in turn then triggers the moral concepts of righteousness and justice. Although possibly getting arrested could be interpreted perhaps as unworthy behaviour because it's not necessarily disciplined or decorous. I would argue that it actually displays more of a high level of commitment to its cause because it's displaying ostentatious sacrifice and willingness to persevere. So this is kind of like how we decided what was going to be tagged as high or low in the various elements of WUNC. So just to kind of conclude that and give you some implications to our findings. In conclusion, we found that the overall representation of pro-choice protesters in the US media shows high scores in unity, numbers and commitment on Tilley's WUNC scorecard, but very low scores in worthiness. And this is because of the frequent coverage of violence and lack of support for the protests from institutional elite figures. So why could this be? Why could it be that worthiness scores very low, but unity, numbers and commitment score very high? Well, news outlets operate within a capitalist economy. So that means to be commercially viable, they need to produce news that is consistent with the ideologies and the thoughts of their readers. The unworthy representations of protests in terms of their actions, in terms of their aggression or violence, hints at a perception on the part of the organisations that their readers will be less positively inclined towards the manner of the protest or even the act of protest itself. And we can see around the world that they're becoming increasingly restrictive laws and more clamped down on protests. So this could be potentially a reflection of that. However, while Della Porta notes that when it comes to the strategies of protest, the aims do not justify the means, our findings suggest that the protesters' aggressive acts may in fact not put off potential supporters. We find that the unworthy representations of protesters actually tend to focus on their actions and not the cause itself. We also must remember that the protesters were represented as highly unified, as large in size, and also committed, i.e. legitimate. So why could this be? Well, this again could be a result of news media trying to represent trends in public attitude towards abortion rights to make sure that their ideologies are consonant with their readerships. So although abortion is a contentious issue in the US, most citizens support women's right to abortion, and the majority also disapprove of the decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. What's more, readerships that also condemn the ruling could actually view the protesters' unworthy behaviour as justified. So, for example, if the protesters are behaving in violent ways, people that agree that the Roe versus Wade ruling should not have been overturned might support that. What's more, the overall depictions of the protesters as highly unified, as highly numerous and highly committed could also then rationalise these violent forms of protest. So for an issue such as Roe versus Wade, where the protester's perspective is largely shared by the public, the news media's possible anti-protest stance has not seemed, in our opinion, and from what our analysis has shown, to lead to the overall delegitimisation of the protesters' cause. In terms of the implications of using the linguistic WUNC framework then that I developed, these findings show that when covering protests, journalists are able to manipulate linguistic manifestations of worthiness, unity, numbers and commitment when discursively representing protests to produce coverage that is in line with their commercially viable ideologies. Applying the linguistic WUNC framework then is therefore a useful way to critically analyse the media representations of protest. I just have my references here if anybody would like to follow anything up, and that's everything from me, so thank you.
That's great, thank you so much, Charlotte. That was really, really interesting. Good to see that it's your WUNC framework has been applied to something so recent. It'd be interesting to see it applied to what's been occurring over the weekend as well.
Definitely.
So great, thank you. Really clear understanding of how you applied Tilley. So I'll open it up to questions. I do have one in reserve, unless somebody wants to sort of jump in now. Okay, well, I'll jump in and give people a little bit longer to think then. I mean, I thought a possibly relatively easy question, or a nicer question to start with, maybe thinking about your WUNC, thinking about Tilly and the worthy unity, numbers and commitment. How easy was it, or is it, to apply linguistic tools and words and things like that to that particular framework? And do you have a sort of a bank of verbs that you have to hand that you share with other people? So do you have like a coding schedule? Because it'd be interesting for you to apply it.
Yeah, it would. I've not actually got kind of like a coding scheme, because I think it can be, as all kind of discursive work is, open to interpretation, and I wouldn't want to almost limit the bounds of what could be considered worthy, unified, numerous, or commitment, lest other linguistic manifestations that I've not spotted kind of not be applied. So I didn't develop a coding book or coding manual. However, some are much easier than others in terms of how to identify. So, for example, verbs are great to see if, for example, worthiness, if you a semantically violent verb can straight away be tagged as an unworthy kind of display. Similarly for unity, so if there's groups of protesters doing the same thing, that's a really easy spot. It's sometimes a little bit more difficult for things like commitment. So I didn't go into a lot of detail about commitment here, but I've written about it in some other publications. There's so many different manifestations of commitment from my interpretation. So sometimes, yeah, it takes some are quite easy to spot, and yeah, oh, that's a bit of a nasty verb, there you go, but others are a little bit difficult.
Yeah. I mean, my question was sort of around unity, actually, and I wondered whether that would be the more difficult category, but it sounds a bit like commitment. Was it? Did you think a little bit?
I think, yeah. But again, it also depends, because I think worthiness can sometimes be a tricky one if we're not looking at verbs. So if we're looking at like who is I can't get my words out, who's advocating for a protest, for example. So if we look at the Capitol protest and the riots a few years ago when President Biden won the election, pro-Trump supporters are going to think that Donald Trump talking out in support of a protest is a really great thing. However, people that don't support Trump are not going to think that. So it's kind of, when we're thinking about who's supporting a protest and who isn't, it's not, we can't strictly just say anybody with institutional authority is then a worthy spokesperson, for example. So I think that's where the waters can get a bit muddied.
Agreed. Does anyone else have anything to ask Charlotte? Aaron, yeah.
Hi, Charlotte. Great presentation. Really interesting research.
Thank you.
I mean, I have a very kind of broad question that I'm still kind of working on, but one's regarding the media outlets themselves. And
Sure.
did you find big differences between? I mean, I guess the ideological orientation of media will determine the way that they talk about protests. So I would expect, I suppose, left media and right media to have a very different stance on them. But also, did you look at kind of non-mainstream media as well? So online media, and if they took a different approach to these?
So we didn't differentiate. We didn't differentiate between left and right, or kind of like mainstream and non-mainstream. What I will say is that because of the we just kind of wanted to look as a whole, but what I will say, because it was over 90% for unity, numbers and commitment that were all high displays, it would seem, although I can't back it up because I've not looked directly, but it would seem as though this pattern was quite consistent across the left and right, because it seemed to be an equal split in terms of the actual organisations that we analysed between left and right. So yeah, I would assume, because it was so overwhelmingly highly unified, highly numerous and highly committed, that was kind of a shared representation.
Okay. So I guess it maybe the worthiness of the protest would be the one where there's going to be higher variance,
I would
which
think.
I guess makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering about it. I don't do research in this area at all, but I have a sort of interest in the way that media do things generally. And I was thinking about some work a PhD student's doing around the End SARS protests in Nigeria. And so that protest initially was completely delegitimized. I mean, the numbers weren't ever questioned, but the way that the protesters were framed as being, you know, anarchists and you know, sort of it was criminals taken to the streets and potential terrorists and all sorts. But that slowly changed, so it'd be really interesting, not asking you about your own research, but really interesting to see this change over the course of a protest. So looking back at the protest where something was successful, perhaps, and attitudes changed, and then where these different elements then come into play, and how, it'd be really interesting to see that over time and in different contexts.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. I submitted a proposal, an unsuccessful one, but submitted one nonetheless, to do a postdoc where I tracked WUNC displays over time for climate change protests. It's something that I'd really like to do. Yeah. Thank you.
Keep trying.
I will.
I
Thank you.
want to read the book.
Yeah, and I guess that's why I wonder if having some kind of coding schedule or book manual that others could use. So, for example, Darren's PhD student, with the caveat, obviously, these are non-exhaustive lists of the types of linguistic formats that you would probably more likely find in Unity. But I guess you will have that largely in some of your other publications anyway, won't you, in the papers, because you've published a bit on Brexit, haven't you?
Yes. So my PhD thesis was about the media representations of Brexit protests, pro and anti, in the UK press. And I have 2 publications from that in which I use my WUNC framework. And in that I describe with as much detail as I can, kind of like how I arrived at these different kind of manifestations. But, and again, just kind of like leaving it a little bit more open. One of them fills in a little bit more than the other, because as you get different data sets and as you kind of look at different things, all these different kind of things emerge. And again, when Gavin and I wrote this paper, it's coming out this month actually. I was hoping it'd be out by the time so I could kind of link it, but the paper's coming out this month on the research that I've just spoken about, and there's different kind of manifestations of WUNC as well, so depending on the data set. But I am publishing a Cambridge element, so it's about a 30,000 word book next year about WUNC. And again, I'm going to be using different data sets. I'm going to be having a look at climate change protests and also the Not My King protests that took place this summer, I believe. I think all these protests, there's so many protests all the time. So yeah, I'm going to be, and maybe because these are brand new data sets to me, that more things will emerge as well.
Yeah.
But if anyone finds any and wants to add to it, please do. I would love that.
Excellent. Good, thank you. Yes, we've got a very interesting talk. Charlotte, thanks for sharing your research from Boy, who is still here actually. Yes, so thank you for that. Yes. Any other questions for Charlotte? Perhaps I can share the paper when it comes out with everyone that's here, and perhaps more broadly in the PSA MPG newsletter as well. I'm sure people will be really interested in it. Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, actually, in terms of the Brexit protest, did you find any of that sort of ideological slant that Darren was talking about? Did you notice that there was a difference, or still not?
It was quite unusual, actually, because I was really hoping it would be really, really juicy. And it turned out not to be analysing it. When I was analysing the Brexit stuff, I was quite gutted, really, because despite the kind of like really staunch divide in the press elsewhere and in ideologies elsewhere about to leave and remain in Brexit, the protests themselves were not particularly covered, or covered in such extreme ideological ways, almost. So that I think oh God, I'm trying to think what I found now, because it feels like ages ago, but it seemed that the Leave press largely ignored any pro-Brexit protest. There just wasn't that much coverage. And the Leave press covered the Remain protests loads more than the Leave protests, which was unusual. But the coverage wasn't, it was divisive to an extent, but nothing compared to some of the things you read about the Brexit ideology in kind of like other sections of the media in terms of the protests. But I think it's probably because the majority, if not all, of the protesters were white, and in terms of the Remain protests were largely middle class. And also the vote had already happened, like we'd already voted to leave, so it was unlikely that it was going to be overturned. So I think a lot of these kind of factors kind of went into the then almost not needing to be that much of a divisive representation of the protests themselves. So yeah,
no, that's interesting, actually. Interesting to see, because Roe versus Wade, I guess, was also post the change in the law. Same with Brexit. So I wonder if there is another research strand in there where you're having a look at things that want to change what is about to happen and how they are then represented. But I think that's
definitely
for another time.
Yeah.
Well, great. I think we'll leave it there unless. Oh yeah, no, Darren, please.
Just a really quick suggestion for further research. It'd be really interesting to talk to journalists and ask them how they frame it, and whether they understand the framework would be an interesting question in itself, I guess. But also, you know, if confronted with their work, was it the intention to either legitimate or delegitimate a protest and things like that? It'd be really interesting to do that kind of work with journalists and see how they approach it, particularly across the spectrum. I guess The Guardian will always legitimate, this is my guess,
sure,
sort of progressive protests, if you like, and then there may be, other questions further along the spectrum. But
definitely.
Just a thought.
No, I would absolutely love to do that. I think it's really interesting as well, because I'm sure a journalist, I mean, I don't know, but I'm sure a journalist doesn't sit down and say, oh, I need to make this worthy, unified, numerous and committed. But is it almost a kind of inherent understanding of what is legitimate, perhaps? I'm not sure, but I would absolutely love to do that.
Excellent. Good. Lovely. Great. Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. We have another thanks from Belur in the chat to say great presentation. Using one framework for discourse analysis is a great idea. Here, definitely.
Thank you.
Gives you a real clear strategy, a clear route through. So great. Lovely. Well, thank you all very much for coming and attending and to listening to Charlotte's presentation. Thank you very much. And take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me as well. It's been lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome, Charlotte. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.